Right. Hello, hello. Let me open my camera so y'all can actually see me. So I don't know why, but I've had this book on my shelf for maybe like a year, and it's from one of the canons in my field of media ecology in like a traditional sense, and I want to read it today. So that's what we're gonna do. Just fair warning for anyone that doesn't know much about media ecology or just, I guess, any field of expertise ever. A lot of what I critique in the field is they need to expand beyond the traditional enlightenment subject kind of work. So anything non-disabled, anything non-white, anything non-cishet and male, from some sort of other privileged stance, and in all of the above, as many forms of academic thought often appeal to. Anyway, we're gonna read this book called The Disappearance of Childhood. We'll see if it's good. It's only 150 pages long, so honestly, the plan was for some reason I want to read all of it today. So we'll see how it goes, or if I end up hating it. That's why on TikTok I have not just reading but also critique, just in case, because I've read some. I mean, I've read a couple books by Postman. Neil Postman is one of the canons of media ecology. For anyone that doesn't know, but he's also steeped in colonial perspectives of Abrahamic religion because he was a literal pastor, if I remember correctly. So anyway, as usual, I'll read the back of the book or the little summary. I can't remember. Yeah, it's the same. So as usual, I also have a little write up of the book on Twitch. I'll point it towards me just because I don't know. I feel like that's the more compelling thing to see on TikTok, but the better view is always on Twitch. So anyway, let's get into. I'll just read it from the back because it's closer to me. So this is what the back of the book says. It says, from the vogue for nubile models to the explosion in the juvenile crime rate, this modern classic of social history and media traces the precipitous decline of childhood in America today and the corresponding threat to the notion of adulthood. I should also state, I forget when this was written. He passed away in the early 2000s, I think. So this is an older book for sure, which is also another, yeah, it looks like it was originally published in 1982, and then this copy was republished in 1984. So when I was 4 years old. So there's odds are good gonna be shit that I'm gonna have to expand on. But anyway, deftly marshaling a vast array of historical and demographic research, Neil Postman, author of Technopoly, suggests that childhood is a relatively recent invention which came into being as the new medium of print imposed divisions between children and adults. But now these divisions are eroding under the barrage of television, which turns the adult secrets of sex and violence into popular entertainment and pitches both news and advertising at the intellectual level of 10-year-olds. Informative, alarming, and aphoristic, the disappearance of childhood is a triumph of history and prophecy. So I'm reading this again, not just so that I can get myself to make sure I'm up to date on learning the canons of my field so that I can know what they've said, but also so that I can best inform myself so that I can critique and expand beyond what they've said, because that's always the deal with literature. And I think a lot of folks usually, both within academia but also outside of it, kind of underplay the importance of the latter, right? It's always adding a pebble to the conversation, and that's something I only learned during my PhD also. Like, it's shifting from recognizing, okay, here's what we think we know at the time, but here's where we can expand on it and make ourselves even better informed. So anyway, we'll see how it goes as I read. As always, anyone that's been here during any of my readings before knows I have a tendency to pause and go off on whatever the person said to make sure that it's as well updated as it possibly can be. So anyway, let's start it. There's a preface from the vintage edition, which, like I said, it probably came out in like the late 80s or mid 80s, whatever. And it goes like this. In preparing myself to write a new preface for this republication of a 12-year-old book, I reacquainted myself with it in considerable detail. This was not an unpleasant task, since all of the books I've written, this one has always been my favorite, which is especially interesting to see. But I was not inclined to pamper it. I was especially looking for predictions, either implied or stated, that have turned out to be wrong. My intention was to tell the reader that I had made these errors and then use this edition as an opportunity to correct them. Believe it or not, I was hoping to find a few important mistakes. The book, after all, has a rather sad theme, made all the more unpalatable by the fact that it offers no strong solutions to the problem it raises, in fact, no solutions at all. If at least some trends towards the disappearance of childhood had been stayed or reversed since the book was written, I would have been delighted. It would bring no shame to me or the book to say something I thought would happen did not, that something I knew to be happening is no longer happening. As it is, I must let the book stand as I wrote it in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Of course, some of the examples I gave as evidence of the erosion of the line between childhood and adulthood will be unfamiliar to young readers. They will have to supply their own, of which there are now many more to choose. More than more. That's a full sentence. The examples one would have available today have a kind of arrogant relevance that I would not have expected a few years ago. To put it plainly, the book sets out to describe where the idea of childhood came from, why it flourished for 350 years, and why it is rapidly disappearing. My rereading of the book, sad to say, leads me to change nothing of importance in it. What was happening then is happening now, only worse. But I have learned something about the subject over the past 12 years that compels me to add something that is not in the book. I would not have believed it could have been in the book, but I am glad to make an amendment here. Over the past 12 years, many teachers from elementary school through university have discussed the arguments and evidence offered in this book with their students, and some of those students have written letters to me expressing their views on the matter. I've been particularly interested in the opinions of students in the 5th and 6th grades, since they're at an age at which children would not only be suffering the effects of an early unwanted adulthood, but could talk about them, even reflect on them. Such students also tend to be direct and economical in their style, having not yet been encouraged to use language to conceal their thoughts. For example, a girl named Norelle concluded her short letter by saying that my ideas were weird. A boy named Jack said, "I think your essay wasn't very good. Childhood doesn't disappear. Snap, like that." Joseph wrote, "Childhood does not disappear because you watch TV. I think childhood is wasted by going to school 5 days a week. In my opinion, that is too much. Childhood is too precious to go to school more than half a week." Tina wrote, "When you're a kid, you don't really have to worry about responsibility. Kids get to play around more." John wrote, "I think 18 is the correct age for becoming an adult." Patty, "I don't think that if a 10-year-old kid watches an adult show, then that kid is never a child again." Andy, "Most kids who watch TV shows know they are not real." There are, of course, many things to learn from such comments, but their main lesson for me is that children themselves are a force in preserving childhood. Not a political force, certainly, but a kind of moral force. In these matters, perhaps we can call them a moral majority. Children, it would seem, not only know there is value in being different from adults, but care that a distinction be made. They know perhaps better than adults that something terribly important is lost if that distinction is blurred. I will stand by the theme of the book. American culture is hostile to the idea of childhood, but it is a comforting, even exhilarating thought that children are not. So, like I said, for anyone that's come in between when I said this before and what's happening now, also, what's up, Fabula? It's okay. Well, thank you for being here while you got a 4% phone. I don't know how this is gonna be, just to make everything clear to everyone. Because, like I said, Postman's got a background in that's deeply it is deeply steeped deeply in I think Catholicism. As far as I know, he was a pastor. So I'm very sex positive and I'm queer. So my concern is that there's going to be some sort of problematic ideas in here, but who knows? Maybe there's not. But just so fair warning. But as they come up, if I see anything, I'm gonna for sure say something about it. Anyway, let's get into the intro. Children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see. From a biological point of view, it is inconceivable that any culture will forget that it needs to reproduce itself. But it is quite possible for a culture to exist without a social idea of children. Unlike infancy, childhood is a social artifact, not a biological category. Our genes contain no clear instructions about who is and who is not a child, and the laws of survival do not require that a distinction be made between the world of an adult and the world of a child. In fact, if we take the word children to mean a special class of people somewhere between the ages of 7 and, say, 17, requiring special forms of nurturing and protection, and believed to be qualitatively different from adults, then there's ample evidence that children have existed for less than 400 years. Indeed, if we use the word children in the fullest sense in which the average American understands it, childhood is not much more than 150 years old. To take one small example, the custom of celebrating a child's birthday did not exist in America throughout most of the 18th century, and in fact, the precise marking of a child's age in any way is a relatively recent cultural habit, no more than 200 years old. To take a more important example, as late as 1890, American high schools enrolled only 7% of the 14 through 17-year-old population. Along with many much younger children, the other 93% worked in adult labor, some of them from sunup to sunset in all of our great cities. But we must not confuse, at the outset, social facts with social ideas. The idea of childhood is one of the great inventions of the Renaissance, perhaps its most humane one. Along with science, the nation state, and religious freedom, childhood as both a social structure and a psychological condition emerged around the 16th century and has been refined and nourished into our own times. But like all social artifacts, its continued existence is not inevitable. Indeed, the origin of this book is in my observation that the idea of childhood is disappearing and at dazzling speed. Oh, thank you, Katie. Oh no, are you serious? I'm really sorry that your account got banned. That fucking sucks. I'm glad that you made another one though. I'm kind of wondering if that's going to happen to me because I keep getting shit that like shouldn't be taken down for community violations getting taken down. So, yeah, fuck what's happening. Part of my task in the pages to come is to display the evidence that this is so, although I suspect most readers will not require much convincing. Wherever I have gone to speak, or whenever I have written on the subject of the disappearance of childhood, audience and readers have not only refrained from disputing the point, but have eagerly provided me with evidence of it from their own experience. The observation that the dividing line between childhood and adulthood is rapidly eroding is common enough among those who are paying attention, and is even suspected by those who are not. What isn't so understood is where childhood comes from in the first place, and still less, why it should be disappearing. I believe I have some intelligible answers to these questions, most of them generated by a series of conjectures about how media of communication affect the socialization process. In particular, what's up, Kanima? How you doing? It's been so long. Oh my god, it's nice to see you even just in like a PTR version. Yay. How the printing press created childhood and how the electronic media are disappearing it. We're reading The Disappearance of Childhood. If you want to see the write-up of it, I have it up on my Twitch. I know that folks on TikTok, I can only point you in one direction, and I decided to point you at my goofy ass. But there's a write-up of it that's on my Twitch if anyone's ever curious. In other words, as I understand what I have written, the main contribution of this book, such as it is, does not reside in the claim that childhood is disappearing, but in a theory as to why such a thing should be happening. The book, therefore, is divided into two parts. Part one is concerned with showing where the idea of childhood came from, specifically, what were the communication conditions that at first made childhood unnecessary and then made it inevitable. Part two puts us in modern times and tries to show how the shift from Gutenberg's world to Samuel Morris's has made childhood as a social structure difficult to sustain and, in fact, irrelevant. There's one question of great importance that this book will not address, namely, what can we do about the disappearance of childhood? The reason is that I do not know the answer. I say this with a mixture of relief and dejection. The relief comes from my not having the burden of instructing others on how to live their lives. In all my previous books, I have presumed to point to a more effective way of solving one problem or another. Professional educators are, I believe, supposed to do that sort of thing. I'd not imagined how pleasant it can be to acknowledge that one's imaginative reach for solutions goes no farther than one's grasp of the problem. The dejection, of course, comes from the same source. To have to stand and wait as the charm, malleability, innocence, and curiosity of children are degraded and then transmogrified into the lesser features of pseudo-adulthood is painful and embarrassing and above all sad. But I have consoled myself with this thought. If one cannot say anything about how we may prevent a social disaster, perhaps one may also serve by trying to understand why it is occurring. Oh, hell yeah. It's nice to see you too, Angus. But yeah, okay, so here's where I don't know how you're all thinking. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what he already just said. And the thing I love about Postman is his writing is phenomenal, and that I've seen, and also 1%. Well, I think that was a good 3% served in the intro. So the thing that I'm most concerned about, and just to anticipate what he may or may not say, which again, I have no fucking idea because I never read this book. I haven't even ever heard of it, to be honest. I forget why I even bought it, but I'm concerned that he's gonna, like, okay, how do I start this thought? So the difficulty for me in talking about this is that as a sex positive person, right, but also a person that's experienced a lifetime of violence, I know how do you that's a really how do you deal with that, like, because you really truly can't talk about sexuality in the US context and arguably around the world without talking about violence, and inherently that's wrapped up in all forms of disenfranchisement that compound that include age. But I also know that, like, it becomes really complicated when you understand just like the profit motive, and I think he's going to speak to that from what I understand. So we'll see what he fucking says, but know that I'm thinking of this and the difficulty of this conversation. It's the same difficulty, to be honest, that I had in when I was creating the TikTok about the filters that just happened a few weeks ago on TikTok, the ones that obviously lured people in thinking that they were going to be like, who's what Hello Kitty do you like more? And then it's like adult content. Like stuff that's luring people in, whether no matter what age they are, and the complications that arise in something that violates someone's consent, especially when we know that it's for profit motive, at least in a late stage neoliberal capitalist context, regardless of whether or not those people were paid or not. It's in a context that's incredibly violent, and that violence doesn't get criminalized. So this is like, I'm hoping that this will give me like more background and share information with everyone that might, be able to parse it out from your own perspective. So anyway, chapter 1 is called When There Were No Children. As I write, 12 and 13-year-old girls are among the highest paid models in America. In advertisements and all the visual media, they're presented to the public in the guise of knowing and sexually enticing adults entirely comfortable in the milieu of eroticism. After seeing such displays of softcore porn, I guess I gotta say corn because maybe TikTok will fucking ban me. God damn it. Okay, I forgot to say. I'm reading a book, TikTok. Don't fucking do it, okay? Jesus Christ. Those of us not yet fully conditioned to the new American attitudes toward children yearn for the charm and seductive innocence of Lolita. In cities and towns throughout the country, the difference between adult crimes and children's crimes is rapidly narrowing, and in many states, the punishments are becoming the same. My other concern that I forgot to say before is I don't know how informed Postman was on how racialized crime is, and that's a whole other fucking animal in, like, obviously a for-profit, like, carceral system. So that's another thing to keep in mind as I'm reading. Between 1950 and 1979, the rate of serious crime committed by those younger than 15 has increased 110 times, or 11,000%. Old timers may wonder about what happened to juvenile delinquency and grow nostalgic about a time when a teenager who cut class to smoke a cigarette in the school lavatory was considered a problem. Old timers will also remember when there existed an important difference between the clothing of children and adults. Again, something that is taking new form today. Within the past decade, the children's clothing industry has undergone such rapid change that for all practical purposes, children's clothing has disappeared. It would appear that the idea put forward by Erasmus and then fully accepted in the 18th century, namely that children and adults require different forms of dress, is now rejected by both classes of people. And this is, again, it's super complicated because it's like, obviously children can't consent to anything because they're not adults, but at the same time, it's like there's so many people that are stealing this idea disingenuously to basically bastardize queerness, and, like, the whole drag queen argument that's obviously totally separate, and I hope he doesn't go there, but we'll fucking see, I guess. Like I said, he said he was writing it in the late 70s and published it in the 80s, so we'll fucking see. Like distinctive forms of dress, children's games, once so visible on the streets of our towns and cities, are also disappearing. Even the idea of a children's game seems to be slipping from our grasp. A children's game, as we used to think of it, requires no instructors or umpires or spectators. It uses whatever space and equipment are at hand. It's played for no other reason than pleasure. But Little League Baseball and Pee Wee football, for example, not only are supervised by adults, but are modeled in every way possible on big league sports. Umpires are needed, equipment is required, adults cheer and jeer from the sidelines. It's not pleasure the players are seeking, but reputation. Who has seen anyone over the age of 9 playing jacks, Johnny on the pony, blind man's bluff, or ball bouncing rhymes? Peter and Ionia Opie, the great English historians of children's games, have identified hundreds of traditional children's games, almost none of which are presently played with any regularity by American children. Even hide and seek, which was played in Puriclean Athens more than 2,000 years ago, has now almost completely disappeared from the repertoire of self-organized children's amusements. Children's games, in a phrase, are an endangered species, as indeed is childhood itself. Everywhere one looks, it may be seen that the behavior, language, attitudes, and desires, even I don't know why even the physical appearance of adults and children are becoming increasingly indistinguishable. No doubt this is why there exists a growing movement to recast the legal rights of children so that they are more or less the same as adults. See, for example, Richard Farson's book, Birthrights. The thrust of this movement, which among other things is opposed to compulsory schooling, resides in the claim that what has been thought to be a preferred status for children is instead only an oppression that keeps them from fully participating in society. I will discuss later the evidence supporting the view that childhood is disappearing, but I want to note here that of all such evidence, none is more suggestive than the fact that the history of childhood has now become a major industry among scholars, as if to confirm Marshall McLuhan's observation that when a social artifact becomes obsolete, it has turned into an object of nostalgia and contemplation. Historians and social critics have produced within the past 2 decades scores of major works on childhood's history, whereas very few were written between, say, 1800 and 1960. Of course, McLuhan's another huge canon of the field of media ecology. What's up, Doogie Mookie? We're reading The Disappearance of Childhood and potentially critiquing it when it becomes necessary. Indeed, it's probably fair to say that Philip Airy's Centuries of Childhood, published in 1962, created the field and started the rush. Why now? At the very least, we may say that the best histories of anything are produced when an event is completed, when a period is waning, what is unlikely that a new and more robust phase will occur. Historians usually come not to praise but to bury. In an event, they find autopsies easier to do than progress reports. See, this is like, I love, like, Postman has those fucking sentences like that are just like, damn. I know, right? Yeah, exactly. That was, I love that, like, that was exactly what came to you also with Dookie Wookie. And this has everything to do with that post that I just made the other day, by the way. At least I'm anticipating that it will. I think that there's something that I'm subconsciously acknowledging and why I wanted to, like, why I was feeling compelled to read this book today, that I think will speak to that. Because think about it. If he says that it was first, like, started as, like, a field in 1962, that's not a fucking coincidence, is it? It never is. But even if I'm wrong in believing that the sudden preoccupation with recording the history of childhood is by itself a sign of the waning of childhood, we can at least be grateful for having available, at long last, accounts of where childhood comes from. Such accounts make it possible for us to learn why an idea like childhood was conceived and to make conjectures as to why it should become obsolete. What follows then is the story of childhood, as a careful reader of much of the available material can best piece it together. Of the attitudes toward children in antiquity, we know very little. The Greeks, for example, paid scant attention to childhood as a special age category, and the old adage that the Greeks had a word for everything does not apply to the concept of a child. Their words for child and youth are at the very least ambiguous, and seem to include almost anyone between infancy and old age. Although none of their paintings have survived, it is unlikely that the Greeks thought it worthwhile to portray children in them. We know, of course, that among their surviving statuses, none is of a child. They are references in their voluminous literature to what we might call children, but these are clouded by ambiguity so that one cannot get a sure view of the Greek conception such as it was of a child. For example, Xenophon tells of the relationship of a man to his young wife. She is not yet 15 and has been brought up properly to see as little and hear as little and ask as few questions as possible. Oh my god. And also, like, how are children going to play the same games? I know that's what I was thinking. Yeah, when we don't have the same types of third spaces. Exactly. That's another damn good point. Well, and again, this was written in the 80s, so this is way before it. So this is a book called The Disappearance of Childhood. That's what we're reading, Liz. We're reading and critiquing. Okay. But since she also reveals that she has been told by her mother that she is of no consequence and that only her husband matters, we cannot clearly judge if we're learning about the Greek attitude towards females or towards children. We do know that among the Greeks, as late as Aristotle's times, oh no, I know. Okay, Liz, that's a really good point because that's actually exactly why I'm reading this and put critique specifically in the title because Postman is actually he was a pastor, and I'm curious. So he's a canon of my field of media ecology, and I know that like there the prevailing theme in my field so far, and I've only been in it for like 5 years ish, is I need to know what I need to take and build off of and what I need to admonish. So this is yeah, this is exactly my thoughts exactly. Yes. And it's a difficult conversation to have because it's like on one hand, we got to make sure that children aren't falling prey to disenfranchisement and like being taken advantage of, but on the other, it's like don't be sex negative. Like so it's like we'll see where what he says about it and what we can add to the conversation. All right. Okay. We do know that among the Greeks, as late as Aristotle's time, there were no moral or legal restraints against the practice of infanticide. Although Aristotle believed there should be limits set upon this ghastly tradition, he raised no strong objections to it. From this, we may assume that the Greek view of the meaning of a child's life was drastically different from our own. But even this assumption fails on occasion. Herodotus, I've never heard of this fucking dude, tells several stories that suggest an attitude recognizable to the modern mind. In one such story, 10 Corinthians go to a house for the purpose